Struggling mechanic fired for saving drowning woman. Next day, she arrives with lifetime contract. Some people's lives change in a moment of glory. For Luis Guerrero, it changed under a hood full of grease, with a wrench in hand and bills piling faster than repairs. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, and he wasn't particularly lucky. He was just a man trying to hold everything together, his job, his mother's health, his dignity, in a town that seemed to have forgotten how to take care of its own. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday at Barnes Auto Repair, a crumbling little garage on the edge of Pleasant Valley, South Dakota, a place where engines coughed more than they roared, and the air always smelled like rust, gasoline, and desperation. Luis wiped his hands on a rag that had once been white, but now looked like it had survived a war. His back ached from the cramped position he'd been in for the last 3 hours, rebuilding the transmission on a Buick so old it probably remembered the Cold War. He was 34, but the lines on his face and the streaks of silver in his hair made him look older. Responsibility aged him. The kind that doesn't let you sleep at night, the kind that whispers reminders about overdue utility bills, rising medication costs, and a mother's heart that couldn't afford to fail. Across the street, the warm smell of coffee drifted from Tony's diner. Luis hadn't been able to eat out in months, but the aroma still tempted him. Inside the garage, things weren't nearly as comforting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while the old rotary phone on the office desk rang for the 3rd time that morning, probably Mrs. Henderson again, asking why her car wasn't ready. Luis knew the answer. He refused to rush work just to save time. Cutting corners meant broken parts and angry customers, and Luis had too much pride to let anything leave his station unfinished. That pride, however, was exactly what kept putting him at odds with his boss. "Guerrero, that transmission still on the table?" barked Chester Barnes, the owner of the garage. Chester had inherited the place from his father, a man who valued honesty and craftsmanship. But the son, Chester only saw dollar signs. Every repair was a transaction, every delay a problem, and every one of Luis's explanations about doing things right instead of fast only made him more irritable. Luis looked up from the bench, trying to keep his voice even. "The synchros were shot. I had to order replacements from Sioux Falls. Should be done in an hour." "An hour?" Chester nearly choked on the words. "You've been on that car 3 days. Do you think time grows on trees? You think customers care about perfect?" "They care about not breaking down again next week," Luis muttered, mostly to himself, but Chester heard it anyway. The air in the garage thickened with tension. It wasn't the first time they'd had this dance. Luis, the meticulous mechanic with a conscience, versus Chester, the man bleeding cash and patience. The garage barely scraped by these days. Chain stores were undercutting them on price. Online parts suppliers lured even loyal customers away. And Chester, he was cracking, fast. The final straw, Luis knew, was probably last Thursday when he took the day off for his mother's cardiology appointment. Isabella Guerrero was the quiet backbone of his world, a woman who had raised him single-handedly after his father's accident on a construction site. Now, in her late 60s, her heart was failing her in slow motion. Luis couldn't afford her medications, not on a mechanic's wages, but he'd moved mountains to keep her going, missed work, skipped meals, took on side jobs fixing tractors in barns for a couple of bucks. And Chester noticed. Oh, he noticed. "You miss one more day, and I swear, Luis, you're gonna miss them all," Chester had threatened that week. And here they were, Chester already looking for an excuse. Luis could feel it. Across the shop, Austin Price rolled out from under a Ford pickup, wiping his hands on a rag. He was younger than Luis by a few years, still full of fire and ideas. The kind of guy who believed things could get better if you just worked hard enough. He gave Luis a nod, having caught the tail end of the argument. "Don't let him grind you down, man. Everyone in this town knows you're the best mechanic around." Luis gave him a tired smile. It meant something, sure, but not enough to buy prescriptions or keep the lights on when Chester's mood flipped. He'd been thinking about applying for night shifts at the truck stop out by the highway, maybe working weekends at the grain elevator, whatever it took to stay afloat. Still, every time he looked at his mother's fragile smile when he came home, he knew it was worth it. She had sacrificed everything for him. Now it was his turn. Outside, the wind stirred dust along Main Street. Old trucks and beat-up sedans moved slowly past the garage, each one a potential customer, each one a story. This town was barely holding together too. The grain mill had closed down 3 years ago. The school had started cutting art classes. Families were scraping by. Maybe that's why Luis refused to cheat his neighbors with rushed jobs and half-hearted repairs. These were his people. He owed them honesty, if nothing else. Then the phone rang again. Chester answered. Luis didn't pay attention at first, until the tone in Chester's voice changed. It wasn't annoyed anymore. It was intrigued, maybe even excited. Chester stepped out of the office with a rare, almost suspicious grin. Reed Construction. They're looking for a fleet mechanic, contract work, good money. They asked for you by name. Luis looked up sharply. Reed Construction was a behemoth around these parts. They built hospitals, schools, commercial centers. Working for them wasn't just a paycheck. It was stability, maybe even a future. The thought of steady income and benefits lit a spark of hope inside him. Then Chester crushed it. "But I told them I couldn't spare you," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Summer's coming. We're going to need all hands on deck. Tourist season, more breakdowns. You're either with us or you're not. Can't have my guys chasing side jobs every time someone waves a few dollars." It wasn't a side job. It was a chance at a better life. But Luis stayed silent, the words caught between pride and desperation. Chester turned away, already writing him off. Luis didn't know it yet, but fate was about to rip that decision away from both of them. In less than an hour, someone's car would go through the guardrail at Pleasant Valley Lake. In less than an hour, everything he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and opportunity would be tested in one breathless dive into freezing water. And by tomorrow, the woman in that car would come back, not just alive, but with an offer that could change everything. The screech of tires shattered the stillness like a gunshot. It echoed over the cracked pavement and across the gravel lot of Barnes Auto Repair, silencing even the ever-present buzz of fluorescent lights. Luis was just unwrapping the ham sandwich his mother had packed that morning, the one with homemade bread and 2 thin slices meant to stretch their grocery budget. He froze, his instincts already pulling him to his feet before his mind could catch up. Across the road, past the diner and down the hill, a plume of white steam began rising into the sky. Something terrible had happened. Austin looked up from his corner, half a sandwich hanging from his hand. "What the hell was that?" Luis didn't answer. He was already moving, cutting across the lot, past rusting bumpers and parked wrecks waiting for second chances. At the edge of the shop's open bay, he could just make out the lake in the distance, past the trees, past the old scenic pull-off. But what caught his eye, what turned a rising concern into full-blown urgency, was the broken guardrail. Twisted metal jutted into the air like bones, snapped backward. Just beyond that, a black shape was sinking into the water. "Call 911, Luis said, grabbing his truck keys. "Now!" Chester said nobody leaves during lunch, Austin called after him, but his voice was already distant, drowned out by the roar of Luis's pickup engine coughing to life. Luis didn't care what Chester had said. There was no room for rules or payroll concerns. Somewhere down by that lake, someone was in trouble, maybe already dying. And if he didn't move now, they wouldn't stand a chance. The tires of his old pickup skidded across loose gravel as he tore out of the lot. The short drive felt eternal. Each block, each familiar storefront blurred past. Miller's Hardware, the shuttered grain mill, the faded welcome sign that hadn't been repainted since Luis was in high school. All of it a blur behind the rush of adrenaline and a single pounding thought: get there faster. As he crested the hill near the overlook, the full picture snapped into view. The metal guardrail was torn clean through. the ground still scarred by fresh tire tracks. And there, maybe 50 yards from shore, the roof of a dark-colored sedan barely peeked above the water's surface. Steam hissed from the submerged engine compartment, mixing with the lake mist to form a ghostly cloud above the wreck. Luis slammed the truck into park and sprinted. His boots hit the shoreline sand, then the muddy bank. Cold wind bit at his face. "Hello?" he shouted toward the sinking car. "Is anyone in there?" At first, nothing answered. Then a faint sound. Rhythmic, desperate. Someone pounding on glass from inside. His boots came off first, landing with a dull thud in the sand. His shirt followed, tossed aside in one fluid motion. The water looked cold. It was worse than it looked. As he dove in, the chill wrapped around his chest like a vice, forcing the air from his lungs. But he didn't stop. The water burned, but fear pushed him forward. Not fear for himself, fear for whoever was still trapped inside that car. As he swam, he could see the car slipping deeper. The roof was almost gone now, the front end angling downward as it began its final descent. Through the distorted surface of the lake, he caught glimpses of movement, hands behind the driver's side window, pale face framed by soaked hair, mouth open in a silent scream. Luis reached the car and gripped the frame. It was slippery with algae and oil, but he held tight. He tried the driver's side door. Locked. The power system was dead. No way to roll down the windows. The woman inside was struggling against her seatbelt, jerking frantically, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fading hope. She pounded against the glass again, weaker this time. Luis ducked under, scanning the car for a weakness. The rear window on the passenger side had cracked on impact. Not shattered, but cracked enough to give him a chance. He surfaced, grabbed a smooth fist-sized rock from the lake bottom, and dove again. The first hit did nothing. The second made the glass spiderweb out. The third strike, a deep, dull crack. His lungs burned. He surfaced again, breathing hard. The car was sinking faster now, the nose fully submerged, rear window almost at water level. He dove again, striking the glass until finally, on the fourth hit, it gave way in a shower of bubbles and sharp edges. Inside, the woman's face twisted with shock as cold water rushed in. Luis reached through, pulling away shards, ignoring the cuts to his arms. He pushed through the tight space and into the car's flooded back seat. Water sloshed to the level of the woman's chest now. Her breathing was shallow, fast. Her lips blue. "I've got you," Luis said, his voice thick with effort. "We're getting out." The seatbelt wouldn't release. He pulled his pocket knife, cutting through the jammed strap. She cried out as he moved forward, discovering her foot was pinned beneath the bent pedal. The crash had crushed part of the dashboard into the footwell. There was no way to pull her straight out. It would break her ankle. He didn't have time for careful, only fast and smart. He reached down, found the brake assembly, and began forcing the pedal sideways, using every ounce of strength and knowledge. It groaned but didn't budge. The car groaned too, metal shifting as water filled every crevice. Time was gone. "Push with your good foot," he shouted. "Now!" She screamed as her trapped ankle came loose, but it worked. Luis wrapped his arm around her waist, guiding her back toward the rear window. They surfaced together, coughing and gasping, barely clearing the top of the water as the car slipped away beneath them. The swim back to shore was slow. Luis kicked with everything he had, the woman's weight dragging on him like the cold itself. She clung to him, half conscious. The shoreline felt miles away, but somehow, through grit, fear, and sheer refusal to fail, they made it. Luis collapsed on the sand, heart pounding out of his chest. The woman coughed violently beside him, alive. Sirens howled in the distance, growing louder. Help was coming, but for the first time in a long time, Luis hadn't waited for help. He'd been it. And while he didn't know it yet, the woman beside him wasn't just anybody. Tomorrow, she'd come back with a pen and a contract. Tomorrow, she'd change his life with the same finality that the lake almost ended it. The sound of the sirens had barely faded when the weight of what Luis had just done began to settle on him like the lake water still dripping from his clothes. He sat there on the muddy bank, lungs heaving, heart racing, arms trembling from exertion, staring at the dented surface of the water where the car had vanished. Only minutes ago, that car had held a dying woman. Now, the only evidence of its descent was a scattering of ripples and a pair of tire tracks ending at a mangled guardrail. The woman beside him coughed violently, pulling in lungfuls of air between choked sobs. Her makeup had long since vanished, her soaked clothes clung to her like a second skin, and her eyes, wide, frantic, disbelieving, locked onto Luis with something between confusion and gratitude. "You're all right," he said, his voice low, rough, still catching up with the reality that they'd made it out alive. "You're going to be okay." She didn't answer at first. Her fingers gripped his forearm tightly, as if letting go might somehow pull her back under the water. Her lips quivered. She blinked hard, swallowing back a tide of emotion before whispering hoarsely, "You saved my life." Luis looked away, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being seen as anything other than the guy who fixed carburetors and told the truth about brake pads. He certainly wasn't a hero. Not in his own eyes. Just someone who saw a car sinking and didn't stop to ask if it was safe. Someone who didn't think twice about the job he might lose or the bills he might not be able to pay. He thought of Isabella, probably in the kitchen right now, listening to the radio or preparing lunch. She had no idea her son had just jumped into a freezing lake and ripped open a car to pull a stranger from drowning. The first fire engine rolled up with a groan of brakes and a blur of red and flashing lights. Paramedics spilled out, rushing toward them with blankets, oxygen, and wide eyes that spoke volumes. One of them knelt beside the woman and began checking her pulse, her breathing, asking the standard questions. Name, date of birth, any injuries. Luis caught her voice through the fog. "Stephanie Reed," she said. "I think my ankle's broken. It's still numb." Then she turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him again. "That man pulled me out. He's the reason I'm here." A second paramedic approached Luis. "Sir, we need to check you too. That water's barely above freezing. You could be in shock or early-stage hypothermia. Let's get you wrapped up." "I'm fine," Luis said, even as his limbs shivered and his teeth began to chatter. "Help her first." "You both need attention," the paramedic insisted, wrapping a silver thermal blanket around his shoulders. "Adrenaline can make you think you're okay when you're not." Luis barely heard the words. His attention was still on Stephanie, who was now being gently placed on a stretcher, her expression somewhere between pain and awe. He could see the way she watched him, not just with gratitude but with curiosity, like she was trying to place him, to understand why a stranger would risk his life without knowing who she was or what she meant to the world beyond this lake. Then came the police cruiser. Officer David Park stepped out, the same man who had given Luis a warning for a busted taillight 2 months ago and always made small talk when they bumped into each other at Tony's diner. He took in the scene quickly, then made his way over. "Luis," he said, eyeing the wet clothes, the bruises, the cuts on his arms. "What happened?" Luis nodded toward the lake. "Car went through the guardrail. She was trapped. I got her out." Park let out a slow breath. "You swam out there? Alone?" Luis just nodded again. "Jesus," Park muttered, his voice low with admiration. "Most people would have just called for help and waited. That car's gone now. If you'd been 30 seconds slower—" "I know," Luis said, and this time he did feel the tremor in his hands, the chill that had burrowed deep into his bones. "But I wasn't." Stephanie was loaded into the ambulance. As the doors closed, she caught sight of him again and raised her hand, weak but deliberate. He nodded back. Then the ambulance pulled away with a rising wail, disappearing toward Pleasant Valley General Hospital. It wasn't until the cruiser and fire trucks followed that Luis realized he was alone again. Just him, the broken fence, and the quiet churn of the lake. He started back toward his truck, his wet jeans clinging to his skin like ice. He didn't need to check his phone. He already knew what message would be waiting for him. Chester had seen the empty garage, had probably asked Austin where he went, and in Chester's world, there were no acceptable reasons for walking off the job, even if you saved someone's life. The phone rang as he sat in the driver's seat, still dripping. The name flashed on the screen, Chester Barnes. He considered ignoring it. Then he answered, "Where the hell are you?" Chester's voice was sharp, angry, the kind of tone that made it clear this was already past a conversation and deep into an accusation. "There was an accident," Louise said. "Someone drove into the lake. I pulled her out." "You what?" Chester barked. "Are you kidding me? You walked off the job during lunch rush? We've got 3 cars waiting and Mrs. Henderson's still calling every 20 minutes. "Someone was drowning," Louise said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice, Guerrero," Chester snapped, "and you made the wrong one. You want to play lifeguard? Go apply at the YMCA. Don't bother coming back. Pick up your check on Friday." The line went dead. Luis stared at the silent phone in his hand, then at the empty road ahead. He wasn't surprised. Not really. Chester had been looking for an excuse, and Luis had given him one. The right one, maybe. But it didn't make the sting any less real. He had no job now, no paycheck coming, no health coverage for his mother, no backup plan. All he had was the memory of cold water, shattered glass, and a woman's terrified face locked behind a window that was almost her coffin. But there was something else, too, something under the fear and the uncertainty, a quiet, stubborn sense of peace. Because when it counted, when someone's life was on the line, he didn't flinch. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't wait for help. He just acted. And no matter what came next, no one could take that moment from him. Back at the lake, the water had stilled again. Calm, silent, as if nothing had happened at all. Luis didn't drive home right away. For a while he just sat behind the wheel of his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from unraveling. His clothes were still soaked, the heater barely worked, and his phone sat dark on the seat beside him. The last words from Chester rang louder in his mind than the sirens had earlier. "Don't bother coming back. Pick up your check on Friday." It didn't seem real, not yet, that someone could do the right thing, no, the only thing, and be punished for it so quickly. The town was small, but the silence inside his truck made it feel enormous and heavy. Every tick of the cooling engine reminded him that there were now more bills than there was income, more responsibilities than answers. Eventually, he turned the ignition and started home, his wet clothes freezing against his skin with every gust through the broken passenger vent. He didn't drive fast. There wasn't anything to rush toward, and he needed to slow his thoughts down before facing his mother. She'd notice. She always noticed. The smallest limp, the tension in his jaw, the crease in his brow. Isabella Guerrero had a sixth sense for her son's struggles, honed over decades of single motherhood, late-night worry, and whispered prayers in a language this town had never taken the time to understand, but she never pried. She waited for him to speak, and when he didn't, she just held his hand and let silence be enough. When he pulled into the driveway, her silhouette was already at the window, lace curtains parted just enough to peek through. The house was small and tired, like everything else they owned, but it was clean, always clean. Flowers bloomed defiantly in mismatched pots on the porch, their color an act of rebellion against the peeling paint. Luis got out, his boots leaving wet prints on the steps, and he steeled himself as he opened the door. She was waiting in the kitchen, stirring a pot of caldo on the stove. The smell hit him first, rich broth, corn, lime, and just enough spice to burn away the cold, but it was the way she looked at him that stopped him in his tracks. Her expression didn't shift right away, not even when she saw the scratches on his arms, or the way his clothes clung to him like they had stories to tell. "I saw the ambulance," she said, her voice calm, "down by the lake." Luis didn't answer right away. He set his keys on the counter, peeled off his jacket, and dropped it in the sink. Someone drove through the guardrail. A woman. She was trapped. I pulled her out. For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. She didn't gasp, didn't panic. She only nodded once, like she already knew. Then she took a towel from the drawer and handed it to him. "Go change, sit down, eat something. We'll talk after." He obeyed, too tired to argue. Upstairs, he peeled off his soaked clothes, dried off, and changed into the last pair of clean jeans he had. The scratch on his forearm was worse than he thought. Red, angry, a jagged slice from the broken window. But it was shallow. The pain wasn't in his body. It was in the weight of everything else. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faded photo of his father on the nightstand. A man who had worked himself into the ground on construction sites just to make sure his boy had books and shoes and a shot at something better. Luis had followed in his footsteps, then swerved off the path. Somewhere along the line, survival had replaced ambition. Back downstairs, the soup was hot, thick with potatoes and shredded chicken. Isabella had already set a place for him. She sat across the table, her fingers moving slowly as she folded the corner of a dish towel over and over again. "I got fired," Luis said after the first spoonful. She looked up. "I left the garage to help her. Chester called and told me not to come back. Said I made the wrong choice." Isabella stared at him for a moment, then reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her palm was warm, worn from years of work, but steady. "Then you don't belong there," she said. Luis let out a bitter breath. "Ma, I don't know how we're going to pay for your meds next month, or the electric. I was already behind. Now I'm—" He trailed off, the shame catching in his throat. "I just don't know." "You saved a life," she said, her voice firmer now. "There are men who work their whole lives and never do anything that matters. Today you did. Dios proveerá, mijo. God will provide." Luis wanted to believe that. He really did. But there was no check coming, no leads, no savings. Just the soup in front of him and the quiet strength of a woman who had seen hard times and never once let them harden her. The next morning came quietly. Luis woke before dawn, as usual, his body aching but restless. His phone had a few missed calls, one from Austin, one from a number he didn't recognize, and one anonymous voicemail he hadn't opened yet. He let it sit. Instead, he walked outside into the morning chill, sat on the porch steps, and stared out at the street. The town was waking up. Old Mr. Callahan was dragging his trash can to the curb. A school bus groaned past, its engine coughing. Normal life for everyone else. Luis had no plan. He could try applying at the parts store, maybe even the truck stop out on Route 12, but none of that would cover half of what he needed. And now, with Chester no doubt poisoning his name to every other garage in a 20-mile radius, he couldn't even count on another mechanic job anytime soon. But despite everything, he didn't regret what he did. Not for 1 second. He'd seen the look on that woman's face, the raw, desperate terror of someone moments from death, and the relief that flooded her eyes when she realized someone had come for her. That moment, he realized, wasn't just about saving her. It had reminded him who he was, what kind of man he wanted to be. Not the kind who watched, the kind who acted. And so, as the sun rose and the weight of unemployment settled on his shoulders, Luis couldn't help but feel that something was shifting. He didn't know how or when or what would come next, but something had to change. Something was already moving, quietly, like a ripple in deep water coming back toward him, and it would arrive sooner than he ever expected. Luis had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when the knock came. Sharp, firm, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the careless thud of a delivery driver. It was purposeful, like someone on the other side already knew exactly what they'd come for. He dried his hands on a dish towel, glanced at the clock, 8:41 a.m., and exchanged a look with his mother, who stood frozen beside the stove, a wooden spoon in hand, eyes filled with quiet concern. Neither of them had been expecting anyone. Luis opened the door slowly. Standing on the porch was a woman in a slate-gray blazer, her hair tied back in a tight bun, a leather portfolio under one arm, and a tablet tucked into her side. She didn't look like anyone from around Pleasant Valley. She looked polished, focused, like someone who spent more time in high-rises than in towns where people still paid in cash and called their mechanics by first name. "Mr. Guerrero?" she asked. Luis nodded. "Yeah. I'm Erica, assistant to Stephanie Reed. May I come in for a moment?" For a second, Luis hesitated, not out of suspicion, but surprise. Stephanie Reed. The name clicked in his mind almost instantly. The woman from the lake, the one he pulled out of a sinking car with his lungs burning and his fingers numb. He remembered the terror on her face, the water filling up around them, the way she clung to him after. Then he remembered the sirens, the paramedics, and how the ambulance doors had shut with her watching him like she was trying to memorize his face. Yeah," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." Erica crossed the threshold without hesitation, scanning the modest home without a hint of judgment, just quiet efficiency. Luis could feel the energy shift in the room, the weight of something unfamiliar. His mother watched from the corner, her eyes narrowed, silent and still. "I won't take much of your time," Erica said, opening the leather folder. "Miss Reed asked me to deliver this personally. She wanted to thank you again for what you did. And, well, she prefers to make things right in ways that matter." Luis raised an eyebrow as Erica pulled out a crisp envelope and handed it to him. It was thicker than a standard letter, sealed with a golden R embossed into the paper. He opened it slowly, unfolding the pages inside. It wasn't a thank you card. It was a job offer. Not just a job, an official, salaried, full-time position with Reed Construction, fleet operations technician, based out of their regional headquarters. Competitive pay, full benefits, health, dental, vision, retirement match, relocation assistance, though it wasn't necessary since their office was only 20 minutes outside town. And at the bottom of the page, typed in clean black font, one phrase stood out like a spotlight in the dark. Permanent placement with advancement opportunity. Luis blinked, reading it again, just to make sure he hadn't imagined it. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice low. Erica shook her head. "No mistake. You've been on our radar for some time, actually. Miss Reed's HR team tried to reach you through Barnes Auto Repair about 2 months ago. We needed someone with your skills to help manage our vehicle fleet. Apparently, your former employer never passed the message along." Luis swallowed hard. Of course, Chester hadn't said a word. The moment he'd heard Reed Construction, he must have shut it down. Maybe out of fear of losing his best mechanic, or maybe just out of spite. Luis had wondered for months why nothing ever came of that one lead he'd sent out. Now he knew. "But after yesterday," Erica continued, "Miss Reed didn't want to wait. She insisted we make this official. She's asked to speak with you personally if you're willing. She'll be at Pleasant Valley General for the next few hours before heading back to the city." His mother was still silent, but her eyes had softened. Luis could feel her watching, almost willing him to believe this was real. He looked back down at the offer letter, the details all spelled out in legal precision. It wasn't just a job. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come around twice. The kind of job that could pay off overdue bills, keep his mother insured, maybe even let him breathe for the first time in years. But even more than that, it was the recognition he had never asked for, but always hoped might exist. The idea that someone, somewhere, had seen not just what he did yesterday, but everything he had been quietly doing for years. "What if I say yes?" he asked. Erica didn't blink. "Then I drive you to the hospital right now. She wants to shake your hand. You'd start Monday." Luis looked at his mother. She gave the faintest nod. Her expression held no pressure, just pride, the kind that said, "You earned this. Don't question whether you deserve it." He turned back to Erica. "Give me 5 minutes." The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Luis had been there too many times with his mother, sitting in waiting rooms, filling out forms he could barely understand, bargaining with billing departments over how much he could pay each month. But this time, he walked through those doors not as a patient son, not as a broke mechanic, but as someone being called upon, someone chosen. Stephanie was in a private room on the 3rd floor, her foot propped up and wrapped in a soft cast. She looked different out of the water, composed, sharp, like the woman behind a multi-million-dollar company. But when she saw Luis enter, her expression softened. She set aside the tablet in her lap and gestured to the seat beside her bed. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. Luis sat, unsure of what to say. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes," she said firmly. "I did." There was a pause. She studied him carefully, her eyes holding a clarity that only came from people who had lived through moments where everything could have ended. "I've had a strange life," she said quietly. "Built a company from scratch, learned how to fight in boardrooms, lost more friends than I can count to stress and ambition. But yesterday, I saw death. It was real, cold, final, and I saw you. You were there without hesitation. I don't know why, but I do know this. People like you are rare, and I don't let rare go unnoticed." Luis tried to shrug it off, but she held up a hand. "I'm not offering you a job out of pity. I'm offering it because we need someone like you. Smart, steady, principled. We've got 200 vehicles in our regional fleet. Trucks, loaders, diesel equipment, you name it, they break. And I need someone who doesn't cut corners when no one's looking. You have that reputation. And after yesterday, there's no doubt." He was quiet for a moment. Then, finally, he met her gaze. "I don't want special treatment. I don't want to be the guy who gets hired because he pulled a woman out of a lake." Stephanie smiled. "Then we're on the same page. You're not being hired for what you did yesterday. That just made me finally push past the gatekeepers who should have hired you months ago." She handed him a pen. Luis stared at it, the weight of everything behind him, every late bill, every greasy shift at the garage, every condescending remark from Chester, every long night worrying about his mother's next refill. All of it brought him to this moment, one signature, one new beginning. He signed. Stephanie extended her hand. "Welcome to Reed Construction, Mr. Guerrero." And just like that, the man who lost his job for doing the right thing walked out of the hospital with a new title, a clean slate, and a future that finally looked nothing like his past. Monday came faster than Luis expected. It always did when something big was waiting on the other side. He'd barely slept the night before, lying awake long after the town had gone quiet, long after even the crickets gave up their song. It wasn't nerves exactly, it was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. That unfamiliar hum beneath the skin when you realize you're about to step out of the storm and into something stable. But it also carried weight. The weight of not wanting to screw it up. The weight of knowing how easily something good could vanish. He'd carried disappointment for so long, worn it like a uniform. That part of him kept wondering if this new beginning was real or just another mirage waiting to disappear when he got too close. The headquarters for Reed Construction sat just outside town, tucked behind a long stretch of highway flanked by wind-swept wheat fields and crumbling fence lines. From a distance, the building looked like something out of a magazine. Modern, glass panels, sleek design. It stood in quiet contrast to the rest of Pleasant Valley, like a reminder that time was still moving somewhere, even if the town hadn't kept up. As he pulled into the company lot in his beat-up Chevy, he caught a glimpse of the fleet yard. Rows of trucks, service vehicles, graders and forklifts parked with military precision. Hundreds of them. It looked more like a logistics base than a construction firm. He checked in at the front desk, was handed a visitor badge, and barely had time to take in the sleek marble floors before a man in a short-sleeved button-down approached, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression of practiced calm. "Luis Guerrero?" the man asked. "That's me. Frank Morrison, Fleet Operations. I'm your guy for today. Come on, let's get you squared away." Frank was maybe in his 50s, with a voice like gravel and the no-nonsense walk of someone who didn't like wasting steps. He didn't talk much as they made their way through the building, just pointed things out along the way. The employee cafeteria, the supply offices, the HR desk, the maintenance bays. When they finally stepped outside and crossed into the fleet area, the temperature dropped a few degrees, both from the wind and the shift in atmosphere. Gone were the polished floors and quiet conversations. Here, it was grease and diesel, engines firing, radios crackling. Luis felt more at home instantly. "You've worked on trucks before," Frank said without looking at him. Luis nodded. "All kinds. Gas, diesel, flatbeds, even compact loaders. I used to fix harvesters on weekends." "Good. That's what I figured," Frank replied. "Stephanie doesn't throw people into my division unless they're real. She said you know your stuff. I'm here to find out if that's true." Luis didn't flinch. "Then let's find out." They started in Bay 1, where a Ford F450 had been having electrical issues. Luis didn't even hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves, listened to the engines stutter, followed the lines, traced the smell of something just slightly off. Within 20 minutes, he'd diagnosed a worn alternator connection and pointed out a fraying serpentine belt that no one else had caught. Frank didn't say much, just scribbled something on his clipboard, nodded once, and led him to the next vehicle. By noon, Luis had worked on 4 trucks, 1 skid steer, and a sight van whose brake system had been misdiagnosed by the previous tech. He wasn't showing off. He just worked, the way he always had. But here, something felt different. People paid attention, they asked questions, they listened. And when he gave suggestions, like organizing a better parts catalog system to cut down on diagnostic delays, Frank didn't brush him off. He wrote it down. Over lunch, Frank sat beside him on a bench outside the main building, chewing a sandwich and sipping black coffee from a stainless steel thermos. "You're fast," he said. "Precise, quiet. I like that." Luis shrugged. "No point in making noise unless something's wrong." Frank chuckled, then leaned back. "Most guys who come through here either think they know everything or panic the minute something doesn't match the manual. You've got instincts, the kind that don't come from books. That's hard to teach." Luis took a sip from his own bottle of water, still unsure where this conversation was headed. "I've got 136 vehicles in rotation," Frank continued. 24 more coming by the end of the quarter. A lot of the guys we've hired over the years weren't ready. They needed supervision, babysitting. We don't have time for that. I need someone who can not only fix problems but stop them before they happen. Preventative eyes, steady hands. You've got both." Luis stayed quiet, letting the words land. He wasn't used to praise. Not from bosses. Not like this. Frank stood up. "Come with me." They headed back into the building, past the service bays, and into a quieter wing of the offices. Frank opened a door to a conference room with a whiteboard filled with schedules, supply charts, and project maps marked in red and blue ink. "This is the future of the division," Frank said, tapping the board. "We're expanding west. Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, satellite yards, long-haul sites, remote maintenance stations. Stephanie's vision is to build a fleet so tight it runs like an engine, not a patchwork. We've got the money. We've got the equipment. What we don't have is the right people in the right seats." He turned to Luis. "You're not just a tech. Not anymore. If you stick around, I'm going to teach you how to run a fleet, build your own crew, oversee procurement, training, logistics. You won't just be fixing things. You'll be leading." Luis stared at him, caught somewhere between disbelief and determination. "Why me?" Frank shrugged. "Because yesterday you didn't wait for permission to do the right thing. That tells me more than a resume ever could." And just like that, the door that had been slammed shut at Barnes Auto, the one he thought might stay closed forever, had not only opened again, it had revealed a hallway of possibilities. Not just a job, a future, not just a paycheck, a purpose. That night, Luis drove home with the windows down, the wind pouring in and whistling around his quiet thoughts. The sky was clear, stars blinking overhead like tiny affirmations. When he pulled into the driveway, Isabella was already waiting on the porch, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He stepped out of the truck, slower now, tired but not from defeat. Tired the way a man is when he's finally done good work for people who see him, who value him. "Well?" she asked with a knowing smile. Luis smiled back, nodded once, and said the words he'd never had the chance to say until now. "I think I finally found where I belong." The first few weeks at Reed Construction passed in a blur of grease, steel, and something Luis hadn't felt in years: momentum. From the moment he clocked in each morning, long before the sun was fully over the horizon, until the last truck rolled through the gate in the evening, he was moving, thinking, solving. It wasn't just repairs. It was diagnostics, procurement issues, scheduling preventative maintenance, creating workflows that would keep 100 different pieces of equipment from dying at exactly the wrong moment. He was part of something larger now. He could feel it. And unlike every job he'd held before, no one was breathing down his neck, waiting for him to fail. In fact, they were listening, really listening. At first, it had taken him a little while to adjust. The tools were newer, the systems more automated. The facility itself was a different world from the crumbling brick and duct-taped tool cabinets of Barnes Auto. Reed's bays were brightly lit, perfectly ventilated, fully stocked. But what surprised him most was how often the other techs came to him with questions. Most of them had years of experience, but they'd seen what he could do, and more than that, they could tell he wasn't in it to show anyone up. He shared what he knew without ego, stayed late to help finish their toughest jobs, and never once hesitated to admit when he didn't know something. That earned him something more valuable than praise. It earned him respect. One afternoon, 2 weeks into the job, a driver came in cursing the transmission on his rig. The service record showed it had been repaired just 3 months earlier by an outside contractor. Most guys would have slapped a temporary patch on it and moved on. But Luis took one look under the hood and knew the real story. A cheap aftermarket part had been used to cut corners, probably to save money on the invoice. He pulled the whole assembly, logged the serials, and reported it directly to Frank. The next morning, a company-wide memo went out. All subcontracted work was suspended pending internal audit. No more compromises, no more short-term solutions. That one call saved the company tens of thousands over the next quarter, and it earned Luis a permanent seat at the table. Frank didn't waste time after that. He brought Luis into meetings, sat him in on calls with vendors, asked his opinion on parts orders, staffing shifts, and long-range planning. Most days they barely exchanged more than a few words, but Frank's trust was unmistakable. When Luis spoke, the older man listened. Sometimes he'd nod, scribble something in a notebook, and change the entire day's plan because of it. Then came the first big test. One morning, a semi-hauling aggregate for a bridge project broke down 2 hours outside the city. The driver was stranded. Dispatch had no nearby coverage. The next scheduled load was delayed, putting the entire concrete pour behind by a full day. Penalties loomed, tensions climbed. Frank was out sick with the flu, and the team was scrambling for answers. Luis didn't wait for instructions. He checked the vehicle's specs, flagged the likely issue based on past maintenance notes, loaded up a service truck, and rolled out. By the time others even realized he was gone, he was already elbow-deep in the engine, waist covered in grime, replacing a ruptured cooling line and a blown fuse panel with parts he'd grabbed on instinct. The driver, a hard-nosed veteran named Colton, who barely said 5 words to anyone, watched in disbelief as Luis worked through the fix like he'd built the thing himself. When Luis finally tightened the last clamp and told Colton to fire it up, the truck roared to life on the first try. Colton leaned against the cab, took a long drag from his cigarette, and said only one thing: "You ain't just another wrench turner, are you?" That afternoon, the project manager called Luis directly to thank him. Not Frank, not a dispatcher. Him. Word had spread, quietly but powerfully. By the end of the third week, Frank called Luis into his office. He didn't make speeches, didn't congratulate him with a cake or a plaque. Instead, he pointed to a spot on the department whiteboard where the words Lead Tech, West Division, had been penciled in faintly. Without even lifting his eyes, Frank said, "Start thinking about who you want on your team. You'll be training them." Luis stared at the board for a long time after Frank walked out. He didn't know whether to smile or panic. He hadn't led anything before, not officially. He was used to being the guy who carried weight, not the one who assigned it. But deep down, he knew he was ready. More ready than most people twice his age with titles and degrees. Because he knew what it was like to be on the floor, sweating over a seized bolt with one eye on the clock and the other on a foreman who never gave a damn. He knew how it felt to do things right and be punished for it. And now he had the power to build something different. The rest of the month flew by. He started sketching out training outlines, compiling tool checklists, mentoring younger techs who had solid hands but lacked confidence. Some days, he still worked side by side with them on the floor. Other days, he was in meetings with logistics coordinators, arguing for smarter vehicle rotation schedules. And every night, he came home exhausted, but it was the kind of tired that let you sleep with your chest unburdened, not the kind that kept you up wondering if the lights would stay on next month. At home, Isabella watched him carefully. She saw the change in his walk, the way he carried himself with a little more uprightness, the way he spoke about his work with a quiet sense of ownership. And though she never said much, she'd started humming again in the mornings while she cooked, just like she used to when he was a boy and the world hadn't weighed so heavily on their shoulders. One evening, as he set the table for dinner, she looked at him and said, "I think your father would have been proud." Luis didn't reply right away. He just nodded, a lump rising in his throat, and sat down across from her. Because for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Not because someone told him, but because now he could see it in the life he was building, with his hands, his choices, and a job that had become something more. A place where what he did mattered, where he was, finally, undeniably seen. Luis stood in the center of Bay 3, grease on his knuckles, a torque wrench in one hand, and a maintenance report crumpled in his back pocket. The midday sun cast long beams through the tall windows, catching particles of dust in the air and bouncing off the chrome edges of truck hoods lined up like obedient soldiers waiting for orders. Every bay was full. Forklifts rumbled outside. Radios crackled with updates from sites as far off as Gillette and Rapid City. On paper, it looked like chaos, but for Luis, it felt like rhythm. Everything, every sound, every task, every call was part of a larger machine that, slowly but surely, he had helped build. And unlike the past, this machine actually respected the people who kept it running. The last 6 weeks had transformed more than just his title. The work had matured him in new ways. He wasn't just turning wrenches and logging reports. He was making decisions, real decisions, that impacted schedules, payroll, equipment lifespans, and even safety outcomes on major job sites. Frank had gradually pulled back, watching from a distance, giving him more space to lead and make mistakes. Not once had he micromanaged. Not once had he stepped in unless asked. That alone spoke volumes. And Luis didn't take the trust lightly. He woke up every morning with a sense of purpose, a mental list already forming before his feet hit the floor. It was exhausting, it was consuming, but it felt like building something that mattered. Every mechanic under him had been hand-picked, not just for skill, but for character. There was Nina, a sharp-minded tech from Sioux Falls, with hands like a surgeon and the voice of a drill sergeant. There was Marcus, fresh out of trade school, still rough around the edges, but learning faster than anyone expected. There was Dan, a former long-haul driver who'd spent 20 years behind the wheel and now used that experience to predict problems before they ever showed up in diagnostics. Together, they worked like a unit, Luis didn't bark orders. He rolled up his sleeves and got in there with them. When something failed, he took the hit. When something worked, he gave the credit away. And slowly that built something harder to fake than results. It built loyalty. The jobs were never easy. In fact, they got harder. With Reed Construction expanding westward, equipment was constantly on the move. Shipped to sites without proper prep, hammered by gravel roads and weather, sent back on tight deadlines needing complete overhauls. There were breakdowns at midnight, emergency calls on weekends. More than once, Luis drove 4 hours just to diagnose a bulldozer with a faulty ECM module before it caused $1 million delay. But every time, he rose to it, not because he had to, because now people expected him to. He was becoming the guy everyone called when things got critical, and he never took that lightly. Then came the offer he didn't expect. It was late on a Thursday. He was finishing paperwork at his desk, nothing fancy, just a refurbished steel workstation tucked between 2 shelves of inventory logs, when he got a message from Stephanie's assistant. She wanted to meet, in person, tomorrow, first thing in the morning. Luis didn't sleep much that night. His mind raced. Had something gone wrong? Had a report been missed? Had someone above his pay grade decided to bring in a new guy with more degrees and less experience? But when he walked into the corner office the next morning, Stephanie was already standing, a tablet in her hands, a look on her face that didn't match any of his fears. It wasn't concern. It was intention. "I've been watching the numbers," she said without preamble. "Fleet efficiency is up 11%, downtime's down by 15%. Vendor cost waste is the lowest we've seen in 3 years, and your team hasn't missed a deadline since you took over." Luis shifted on his feet. "Just doing the job." "No," she said, tapping the tablet. "You're redefining it." She walked to the window and looked out over the yard where trucks were loading up for another long haul. Then she turned back, her expression firm. "I want you to lead the new division, Western Fleet Support. Full authority to hire, train, set standards, and build the operation from the ground up. You'll have an expanded budget, direct report to me, and a 6-figure salary with bonuses tied to performance. I'm offering you more than a promotion. I'm offering you ownership of a vision." Luis couldn't speak at first. The words hung in the air like smoke. He thought back to that day at the lake, to the drowning car, to Chester's voice firing him over the phone, to the months of doubt and pressure and late nights wondering if anything would ever change. And now, here he was, not just seen, but trusted to build something with his own name on the foundation. "You don't need to answer now," Stephanie added, softening slightly, "but know this isn't charity. I've made million-dollar mistakes before. You're not one of them. You're what this company needs next." Luis looked down at his hands, still calloused, still marked from decades of hard labor, and slowly nodded. "I'll do it," he said, "but only if I can bring my crew with me." Stephanie smiled. "I wouldn't have expected anything less." That night, Luis drove home in silence. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the world in gold and deep indigo. At a red light, he looked at his reflection in the side mirror. The same eyes, the same face, but not the same man. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't surviving. He was building. Finally, brick by brick, with calloused hands, with hard-won trust, with everything he'd earned and nothing he'd begged for. And somehow he knew this was still just the beginning. 3 months later, Luis stood in front of a building that didn't even exist when he first started with Reed Construction. The signage wasn't up yet, but the structure was finished. Steel walls, high clearance ceilings, polished concrete floors, reinforced bays wide enough to house anything from a half-ton pickup to a 70,000-pound grader. It was the new regional fleet hub, and it had his fingerprints on every beam, every workstation, every schedule taped to the wall. He hadn't built it with a hammer or nails, but with choices, hard ones. Long nights, early mornings, months of testing systems, vetting vendors, and training staff who, piece by piece, would become the foundation of something that ran bigger than any one man. It wasn't just a service center. It was a command post, a living, moving engine for the company's western expansion. Inside, the place buzzed with activity. One crew was assembling the parts room, organizing shelves by VINs and equipment classes. Another was mapping the lift points for a rotation schedule Luis had designed himself. Every machine would be inspected, logged, and approved before heading to a job site. No guesswork, no shortcuts, just a system that worked the way it always should have. Luis walked through the space slowly, clipboard in hand, double-checking install notes while giving quiet feedback to the crew. They moved around him with a rhythm that had taken months to cultivate, but now ran like second nature. These weren't just hires. These were the kind of people he'd waited his whole life to work beside. Honest, sharp, hungry to learn, and most importantly, proud of what they were building. Reed Construction hadn't spared expense, not because it was a vanity project, but because Stephanie understood what Luis had been trying to prove since day one. That equipment failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a liability. Every breakdown delayed roads, bridges, water lines, schools. A blown cylinder in one loader could hold back an entire development project. But with the right team, the right tools, and the right culture, Luis believed the downtime could be nearly eliminated. So far, he'd been right. Stephanie visited once a week now, sometimes unannounced. She didn't come to check up on him. She came to learn, to listen. She would ask what he needed, where he felt the pressure building, what policies needed rewriting. And when he spoke, she actually took action. That still shocked him sometimes. After years of being talked over and second-guessed by small-town bosses who saw him as expendable labor, it was strange to sit across from the CEO of a multi-state firm and feel heard. But maybe that was the biggest shift of all. Luis wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a leader, and leaders didn't wait to be validated. They built proof with every step. One afternoon, as the crew clocked out and the building emptied of noise, Luis stayed behind. He wandered through the bays, slow and thoughtful, looking at the polished floors and half-unpacked tool chests, the diagnostic computers already humming to life. He stood in front of Bay 4, where a flatbed was parked, its front end lifted, hoses hanging loose like veins waiting to be repaired. The job wasn't scheduled to start until tomorrow, but Luis rolled up his sleeves anyway. It wasn't about putting in extra hours, it was about staying grounded, about remembering that no matter how many titles you earned, you never outgrew the work. While replacing a fuel filter under the hood, he thought about the team back at Barnes Auto. He hadn't heard much from Chester, but the rumors that floated around town said the shop had lost nearly all its regulars. People found out what had happened, how Luis was fired, not for failure, but for heroism, and many walked away. Austin had sent him a text a few weeks ago, asking if Reed was hiring. Luis hadn't responded yet, not because he was holding a grudge, but because he wasn't sure if Austin was ready for what this place required. Excellence wasn't just expected here, it was assumed. By the time he finished the job, the sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long orange shadows through the high windows. Luis washed his hands in the utility sink, dried them on a shop rag, and sat for a moment at the small metal desk tucked in the corner of the floor. It was cluttered with blueprints, checklists, old invoices, messy in a way that only made sense to him. But at the center sat one object that made him pause every time he saw it. A framed photograph. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside his mother in front of their old house, smiling through years of struggle. He'd placed it there on day one, not for decoration, but as a reminder that no matter how far he rose, he'd never forget where he started. The office phone rang. He answered. "Luis, it's Darla from scheduling. We've got a new site starting up outside Cheyenne. They're asking if your division can prep the equipment and do first service on location." He didn't hesitate. "Tell them yes, we'll make it happen." And just like that, another project was in motion, another ripple in the web of responsibility that stretched wider every week. Luis wasn't overwhelmed by it. He thrived in it. The pressure had become a kind of fuel now, proof that his instincts, his experience, his unshakable belief in doing things the right way, it all added up to something that could scale, something that could last. Later that night, back at home, he found his mother sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a small notebook in her lap. She looked up as he stepped onto the porch, eyes lighting up with that soft glow he remembered from childhood, when she used to wait for him to come home from school, or from those late-night shifts in the garage when he was barely scraping by. He sat beside her, the night air crisp and clean. "How was the day?" she asked. "Long," he said. "Good." She smiled and handed him the notebook. "You said you wanted to start writing down what you're learning, for the next crew, so no one has to figure it out the hard way." Luis opened the first page. It was blank. He stared at it, pen in hand, then finally began to write. Because now the hard part wasn't surviving. It was building something that would outlast him. It had been almost a year since Luis Guerrero dove into that freezing lake and pulled a stranger from a sinking car. Almost a year since he got fired for doing the right thing. Since he walked away from the worn-out concrete of Barnes Auto, soaked to the bone, jobless, exhausted, but strangely at peace. Now, as he stood in the driver's seat of a brand-new service truck parked at the edge of town, he found himself staring back at the past, not in memory, but in steel and silence. Barnes Auto Repair sat quiet in the distance, its garage bays closed, the sign half hanging from its rusted bracket, swaying in the wind like a flag surrendering to time. The lot, once filled with cars and the low hum of compressors and cursing, was empty except for a single oil-stained sedan with a flat tire and a sun-faded "For Lease" sign propped in the front window. The place looked smaller now, shrunken, fragile, and Luis didn't feel anger when he looked at it, just closure. He let the engine idle for a minute, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to take the moment in. It wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reflection. So much had changed, and yet this stretch of cracked asphalt hadn't moved an inch. But he had, in every way. What had once felt like the edge of his world was now just a bend in the road behind him. His phone buzzed gently in the console. A text from Marcus read, "Cheyenne crew is ahead of schedule. Dispatch says we're cleared for the Idaho site if we want to jump in early." Luis smiled. That used to be the kind of update he'd dream of getting. Teams running without him, systems in motion that didn't fall apart the second he stepped away. It meant the division was solid. It meant leadership was sticking. And it meant that, after all the years of pushing uphill, he had finally built something that didn't rely on him being everywhere at once. That was the mark of real progress. Not just being good at the job, but teaching others to carry the standard forward. He turned off the truck, stepped out, and walked across the empty Barnes Auto lot. Each step echoed faintly in the dry wind. He peered inside through a dust-streaked window. The same stained floor tiles, the same pegboard wall where tools used to hang in uneven rows. There were still a few cans of oil on the shelves, long since expired. But what caught his attention was the note taped to the inside of the glass, handwritten in fading ink. "Closed until further notice. Thank you for your support." No mention of reopening, no promises, just the quiet admission of a place that couldn't keep up. Luis stepped back, took one last look, and walked away. The drive back to headquarters was long but familiar. The kind of route he used to take, wondering if he was wasting his potential, if anyone would ever notice the care he put into his work. Now it was just a drive, peaceful, steady. He rolled down the window, letting the cool breeze carry in the scent of wheat fields and diesel and dust. It reminded him of childhood, of long days spent in his father's shadow, learning the names of tools in Spanish first, English later, learning how to feel for problems in an engine the same way a doctor might feel for a pulse. Back then, fixing things wasn't about money. It was about pride, about understanding the machinery of the world around you and proving day after day that your hands could make it right. At headquarters, the new building was bustling, deliveries being checked in, dispatchers coordinating equipment runs, new hires walking through orientation, clipboards in hand. Luis parked and walked straight to the operations wing, where his name now sat etched into the glass of a door. Luis Guerrero, Regional Fleet Director. He still wasn't used to the title, but everyone else was. To them, he was already that man, the one who got the calls when the situation was impossible, the one who answered calmly and made the plan, the one who hired based on integrity, not convenience, the one who, when things went wrong, didn't point fingers, he picked up the wrench. Inside, his office was exactly how he liked it, clean but lived in. A whiteboard filled with diagrams and notes from the latest equipment upgrades. A photo of his mother smiling beside a blooming garden. And next to that, pinned beneath a thumbtack, the original offer letter from Stephanie Reed, now slightly yellowed at the edges. A reminder of the moment everything shifted. He glanced at the framed note she'd sent a few weeks earlier. "You didn't just save a life, you redefined a standard. Thank you for showing us what leadership looks like." Luis sat down, pulled out his notepad, and began drafting plans for next quarter's rollout. Montana, Utah, parts of Nevada. The expansion was real now. He was meeting with logistics leads, infrastructure engineers, field supervisors, and they were asking him, not telling him, how to scale the systems he'd built. The man who once begged for a chance to be heard was now shaping the voice of an entire division. Later that evening, back at home, Isabella sat on the porch again, watching the sunset with a wool blanket draped across her shoulders and a small dog-eared paperback in her lap. Luis sat beside her with 2 mugs of coffee, both still steaming. She didn't say much at first. She never did when she was proud. She just rested her hand on his and smiled. "I went by the clinic today," she said softly. "They said the new insurance plan covered everything, even the heart scan." Luis nodded, his throat thick. "Good. That's good." There was a long pause before she added, "You did that." He looked down, unsure what to say. He hadn't saved the world, but he had saved this, her peace, their home, his dignity. He had built something that would last, something that didn't rise and fall with the moods of small men in dying garages. After she went to bed, Luis stayed out on the porch a while longer. The stars were starting to show. A soft wind stirred the tall grass. Somewhere down the road, a truck rumbled by, one of his, maybe, part of a system he'd created, part of something greater. And he realized then with quiet certainty that the lake hadn't taken anything from him that day. If anything, it had given him back everything he thought he'd lost, his purpose, his direction, his worth. And it had given him a beginning, one he'd earned, one he'd never let go,